Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be about the Canon R6. I've been using this camera for the last 6 months, and I really know the ins and outs of it at this point, so I felt it was time to just make a really nice video about what are the good things, what are the bad things, whether I think it's worth buying, and what you should know about it. I'm just going to run down the spec sheet real quick for you. I know most of you know this already. This camera uses a 20.1 megapixel sensor. It's powered by the Digic X processor. Shoots up to 4K 60 frames per second with a minimal crop. Shoots at 1080p at 120 frames per second. You get C-Log 3 and C-Log 1. This camera has 2 card slots. It uses USH2. This camera also includes IBIS, or internal body stabilization. It has 1/8000th of a second shutter speed, 3.69 million OLED electronic viewfinder. It has a 2.95-inch LCD vari-angle touchscreen. It shoots 12 frames per second in mechanical shutter mode and 20 frames per second in electronic shutter mode. Okay guys, so the first thing that I want to talk about with this camera is shooting videos with it, because that's what I do the most with it. So we're just going to address the elephant in the room right away here. We're going to talk about the overheating with the Canon R6. Now, it's a very real problem. And basically what I've come to the consensus of is if you're shooting in a room that's air conditioned or temperature controlled, then you are going to get that 30 minutes that Canon says that you're going to get. And that's what I wish they were a little more clear about. In a controlled environment, you will get that 30-minute shooting time. As soon as you start to go into warm summer temperatures outdoors in the sun, anything around 90 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to see seriously diminished times when it comes to shooting in 4K 60 or even 4K 24. Now, the overheating is such a problem that you will actually feel physical heat in the handle of the camera, and that's something that I think people should be aware of, because I see a lot of people thinking that, a new firmware update is going to give them a ton more recording time, and they have put out some updates that did increase the recording times when they introduced the IPB light compressions. But I wouldn't expect too much more to come out of this camera, just because the physical heat is really there and it's not dissipating fast enough that I think they would be able to really increase the recording times any meaningful way past what they've done already. Now, once you get past the fact that it does overheat, and that's the reality of this camera, the 4K quality is absolutely beautiful. It's actually shooting 5.1 super sampled when you're shooting at 4K 60 frames per second. So the cinematic 4K 60 frames per second mode that this camera shoots is producing absolutely beautiful quality. It's by far the best quality of any of the cameras that I've owned. And for something that's a hybrid camera that shoots stills like the R6, it's really, really impressive to be able to get this type of footage out of this camera. So, albeit that you are going to have to pay attention to the times that you're shooting, it's really worth having that quality of footage that you can get out of this camera. And with 30 minutes, you can still produce really nice projects with that. The 1080p 120 frames a second mode with the Canon R6 does come out a little bit softer than the 4K footage, but it's still totally usable and really good footage. It works really well, and I really enjoy having, the dual pixel animal tracking eye autofocus while being able to shoot at 120 frames a second. So that being said, still totally usable, just not quite as sharp as the 4K footage is. The Canon R6 comes with C-Log and now C-Log 3. Both really a joy to use, very easy to correct in post, and do increase the dynamic range of the camera. So those are very welcomed additions to this camera, and I very much enjoy using them. One thing I will say about the Canon R6 is that there is noticeable better dynamic range than any of the other cameras that I used before. Now, I used the Canon RP, the Canon M50, and the Canon T6 before the R6. So those cameras might not be fair to compare to this one since the price ranges are so different, but there is a noticeable change in the dynamic range that I can capture with this sensor. This camera is absolutely great in low light conditions. The high ISO capabilities of the Canon R6 far surpass any of the cameras that I've ever used before. I can shoot at almost ISO 12,800 and still get decently clean images, which is really impressive. So this camera is really a low light king, like everybody else has said about it. Some of the bad things when it comes to shooting video is the rolling shutter is still pretty bad, especially when shooting 4K 24 frames per second. When you're shooting 24 frames per second, you still have to be really careful about panning, with any amount of speed, as you're going to just see that rolling shutter present itself and you get that kind of wobbly jello look that's undesirable. So that's something that Canon still hasn't been able to surpass. It's a lot better in 4K 60, or even if you drop resolution and shoot in 1080, but 4K 24, it still really is a problem that does present itself really easily. So with the update of 1.3, they introduced IPB light compressions. When we first got the camera, all we had was regular IPB compression, and now you have the choice of whether you want to shoot in IPB or IPB light. So IPB light basically uses about half of the memory. It's easier to work on your computer in post because you won't have to produce proxies if you're using any type of Intel or Ryzen setup to edit your footage. The one thing I will say about the IPB light compression is I don't notice a significant decrease in image quality. So that is what I use when I make my projects. That being said, you know, the newer M1 laptops are able to handle the IPB regular compression, so in the future I'm hoping to get one of those and be able to step up using the higher quality compression. But the IPB light, like I said, doesn't show any meaningful image degradation, so I don't see any problem with using them, and it's really nice to be able to just work with something without proxies. Okay guys, so the next section I'm going to talk about is shooting stills with the Canon R6. Now, the one thing I will say is that the files, or the raw files, that this camera produces, I can recover the shadows so much more than I could with any of my other cameras. Like, I can recover shadows without introducing noise, and that's one of the biggest things that I really wanted from raw files. So that made me super happy about the R6. Also, you're able to really recover the highlights very well, and the flexibility of it all is just so much more than, say, like using my RP or my M50 or T6, right? So that being said, I do think that the sensor is a significant upgrade in the R6. To me, the Canon R6 really excels as a sports or wildlife camera, and that's because it shoots at 12 frames per second with mechanical shutter or 20 frames per second with silent shutter. So, you know, being able to shoot completely silently with full manual control at 20 frames a second really makes this really excel as a wildlife or sports camera. In addition to that, you've also got the 20 megapixel sensor. I know a lot of people are concerned about only having it be 20 megapixels, but the one thing that's good about having a lower megapixel sensor is that you have really good low light performance. So the low light performance, or the high ISO capabilities of this sensor, mixed with the fact that you're shooting at such blisteringly fast frames per second, really makes this excel at shooting, you know, birds in flight or any type of fast action that you may want to photograph. That's one thing that I wanted to address, is the fact that this camera has a 20 megapixel sensor. A lot of people may be taken back by the fact that it's only 20 megapixels because a lot of older cameras actually have higher megapixel sensors. I was concerned about it too when I first got this camera, and I'm glad to say that I was able to shoot birds in flight. I was able to crop down like 75% of my image, going down to like a 5 megapixel image, and that wasn't a problem at all. So I'm still able to really crop these images without any problems, so I don't think it's anything that the average photographer is going to have to worry about. If you're holding back on buying the Canon R6 just because of the 20 megapixel sensor, don't worry about it. You're going to still totally be able to crop your images, and it's absolutely an astounding sensor. The Canon R6 comes with 3 dials. You've got one right here for your index finger, you've got another one here for your thumb, and then you've got a spinning one on the back which your thumb has easy accessibility to as well. So having those 3 dials mixed with also the control ring of either the adapter or on the new RF lenses means that you basically never have to dive into your menus at all while shooting. One great thing about the Canon R6 is that when the camera powers down, it's extremely quick to power back up, and it's really responsive, so that's what's really nice. Some of my other cameras weren't like that, so if you allow the power to power it down, it's one tap of the shutter speed, and that camera's up and ready to shoot in less than half a second. So there's really no problem with responsiveness of this camera, which is something that was really nice to see that Canon improved on the mirrorless cameras. Now this camera does fit in your hand really nicely. I like the grip. I like how deep the grip is. It fits my fingers perfectly. The one thing I will say about this is I think it's because of the internal body stabilization, but this body is noticeably heavier than, let's say, something like my RP, or very much heavier than something like my M50. So if that's something like that you were thinking about, like, you know, kind of walking around and using it all day, I'm not saying you can't do that with this body, but it is noticeably heavier to walk around with than even the RP body. Now, some people might complain that this has the old dial, right, compared to having the nice screen on top of it like the R5 does, and then has that other kind of more of an electronic menu to switch through things, but I honestly prefer this physical dial. It's just simpler, easier, everybody's used to it. Weather sealing on the R6 is very good. I have used it and tested it. I've had it out in the rain many times and never experienced any problems or any leaks in any way. So the weatherproofing is very good on the R6. Okay guys, so I just want to go over the overall consensus of this camera, and overall I've been extremely happy with this camera. I know that some people, will, call out the fact that it overheats in 4K and things like that. It does have its fallbacks. Of course I wish that I could shoot in 4K unlimitedly, but that's just not the case. And one thing that I do want to say about that, the one thing that I found that helped in the real world as much as possible is to set this camera so that it powers down after 30 seconds. Because that's one thing that you want to understand, is that even when you're not recording, if you just have this sensor on and you're looking or seeing an image, the processor is working at that point, and the sensor is overheating at that point. So it's very important that you're only keeping the camera on while shooting in 4K when you're actually shooting. When you're not shooting, you want that camera to shut off, because that's the only point that the sensor is going to start to cool itself down. And that's going to increase your time that you actually get to shoot when you're out on your scenes. And I found that it helped me quite a bit. The video quality out of this camera is everything and more that I could have ever needed, especially seeing that, I'm not a professional. I'm just a, avid enthusiast that runs a YouTube channel. I do chase after image quality very much, so this has pleased me so much, because the other cameras, while they were good, I really had to just pay attention to my settings, and my lighting and everything had to be perfect to get really good image quality. This camera is going to allow you flexibility. The ISO could crank up a little bit. It's not going to ruin your image. You're going to have major flexibility because of being able to shoot in C-Log 3. So it's just it's almost easier with this camera to get perfect image, whereas with a lower end camera you can still get really nice image quality, but everything, all the conditions need to be perfect, where something like this is going to allow more flexibility and being able to get perfect images in not ideal situations. The autofocus is definitely a reason to think about picking up the R6. The dual pixel 2 autofocus that Canon has made is a huge step forward in comparison to the RP or the R. There's animal eye tracking now, and not only that, I mean, the animal eye tracking is amazing, but all of the eye tracking, or all of the tracking in general, is just much more fast, much more aggressive, and much more stickier. It's going to stay on your subject. You're going to lose less shots with this autofocus. The IBIS was something that I was super excited about with this camera, and while it's a very welcomed addition and I'm glad that I have it, it's funny because I don't notice a huge difference in the end production of it. So if that's one of the reasons that you're mainly thinking about getting it, you may be able to hold back, because I always felt that Canon, with the stabilization in their lenses, works very well. And I don't notice a massive difference like they try to tell you is going to be there. Like people talking about, oh, I'm taking shots at 2-second exposures handheld and it's perfect. That hasn't been my experience. Maybe I'm just not as steady as those people, I don't know. But the IBIS is a great addition and I do love it, but I don't think it makes a huge difference to the end production of what I'm making. And hey guys, if you think this video helped you in any way, think about going below, subscribing, clicking the notification bell, and I'll see you on my next video.